So I just want to welcome everybody. My name is Bethsaida Ruiz, and I am one of the co-facilitators or co-hosts for this afternoon's conversation. And you're joining us for this great conversation that is based on a book that we'll be talking about more as we move on. And it's called We Keep Us Safe, From Police and Prisons to Care and Community. With author, community leader, and lawyer Zach Norris. There's the book, and again, myself, Bethsaida Ruiz, and Aryeh Shell are the co-hosts. I want to start with Zach's quote: "If we are able to transform our old system and create a culture of caring and healing in its place, we may have an actual shot at creating real democracy for the first time." And that is definitely the theme that I felt throughout your book as I was listening to your book, Zach. This conversation is a part of a series of mandates I feel that are coming from these times, being loudly requested by the folks that are out there making demands and are facing a need to bring about real change. So let us get started. And Aryeh is actually gonna kind of center us a little bit more. You're muted.
Thank you, Bethsaida, and welcome to everyone. It's really exciting to have this conversation right now and be a part of it. I wanted to ground us as we are talking about community safety. One aspect of that is really rooting in place and coming into right relationship with the place we're in. And one practice and one way of doing that is really acknowledging the land and the original peoples. So just want to say that where we are here located currently, the Thrive community, we want to recognize and respect the traditional stewards of this land. We are in Huichin territory on occupied Ohlone land, otherwise known as Oakland, California. And that the Ohlone people are engaged in ongoing struggle in reclaiming their land and sacred sites, and also offering an incredible amount of wisdom and guidance for how we can move through these times. And that land acknowledgement is just one small way we can begin that process of recognizing and reconciling the harm of the settler colonial project, right? And it's rooted in the theft of land and ongoing genocide of Indigenous folks. And so we want to acknowledge that and also lift up the presence in leadership of the Indigenous communities. So if you are interested in learning more about both the Ohlone land as well as just the territories where you are living and sheltering in place, Joshua just dropped a couple of links in the chat, so we encourage you to check that out. And wanted to also ground us in who we are as Thrive East Bay. We are a community of folks that have been convening in a multitude of ways for the last 5 years. We intersections of meaning making, of belonging, of art, social change. We're very rooted in the values of social and ecological justice. And our community of practice, practicing liberation together, building those bridges of authentic relationship across difference, and grounding ourselves in those relationships and building trust, and also being inspired by our choir, by the wisdom keepers and thought leaders in our community. So we are guided as a community by 4 principles. One is to live thriving lives and to support each other to thrive and bring our full gifts and medicine into the world. Love in action is our second one, and we see love as a verb, that we want to show up for each other and engage in practices of mutual aid and care and in resilience and solidarity. Our third principle is shared inquiry and practice, knowing that we are a species in evolution and that we have a lot of learning and a lot of unlearning to do, and to be in practice together, recognizing that we are always practicing something, and we want to be deliberate with what we practice and aligning that with what we care about, what we value. And our fourth principle is systemic change, in recognizing that no one can thrive unless we dismantle these structures and systems of oppression, and rebuild and shift our world from a world that is been rooted in domination and extraction and violence to one that is really grounded in love and our interdependence and regeneration. And that's very much at the root of what we're going to be talking about for the next 90 minutes, is what do we need to dismantle and what can we build in its place. I want to acknowledge that we are in a historical moment. Many have called this a portal, but also that there has been a lot of loss and grief in this time. We are 4 months into a global pandemic that we have seen 9 million cases globally. We are approaching 500,000 deaths on a global scale, and 120,000 of those in the US alone. So actually just taking a moment to just to breathe that in and to extend our care and prayers out for folks who have been impacted by this. You know, we're all being impacted by this, and also recognizing the disproportionate impacts that this disease has had on the Black community and the Indigenous communities and Brown communities, because of all of the disparities and inequities that have been built into this system that have been really laid bare in many ways. And in this, last months, we have also seen more clearly the deeper pandemic of structural racism and police brutality, with the deaths of Ahmaud Arbery, of Breonna Taylor, Tony McDade, and George Floyd, and knowing that they are part of a long line of folks that have been killed by state-sanctioned violence and murder and public lynchings, and that this has given rise to a global uprising for Black liberation, and that we are at a moment where the status quo is literally killing us, and we need to find a new way forward. And right now, that is, these calls for abolishing the police and defunding the police, and that conversation being at the center of our nation, and really thinking about what does that mean, and what is our vision going forward? How do we create true community safety? We are seeing Confederate and colonizer statues coming down. We have seen already in Minneapolis, all 9 members of the city council, a veto-proof majority, who pledged to dismantle the police department, promising to create a new system of public safety in a city where law enforcement has long been accused of racism. We saw last night in Oakland, right? A unanimous vote, 7-0, to pass the George Floyd resolution, eliminated the Oakland School Police Department and getting cops out of the classrooms out of 126 public schools, y'all. And this has been, a decade of visionary work by the Black Organizing Project, and just want to give props and a big shout out to this incredible victory. And also the complication, right? Oakland city budget was pushed through, a lot of folks not seeing the budget in time and only reducing the OPD budget by 1%. So we've still got work to do, but it's an exciting time, and we're just really excited to hear more from you, Zach, because I know you've been doing a lot of work and thinking about this.
Appreciate it.
Yeah. So I would like to actually just take one more moment for all of us as we're talking about safety, and what that means, and to recognize that it starts in our, there's all the systems work and the policy work and all that we need to do, but we are biologically wired for safety. right? And we've also experienced harm and intergenerational trauma. And so there's ways that I think as we enter into this conversation, I would like to just invite all of us who are here listening, and for us, you know, in this conversation, to just start by taking a few breaths and grounding in our bodies. So just feeling our feet on the ground. And whether you're sitting or standing, just letting your spine get a little bit longer and inviting more breath into the body and sensing into our dignity. And I'm going to invite everyone to just take a look around wherever you are. So let yourself orient to the place you are in. So that might mean, you know, taking in the textures, the shapes, the colors. See if there's anything that is pleasing to your eye, or that makes you feel connected or grounded. And invite you even to take a look behind you, just to, you know, see, let the body know that right now we're safe, we're good. Letting our senses awaken, letting any sounds come in, feeling of contact, the temperature. Beautiful. So just, yes, wanting to continue practicing building that internal safety in our bodies as we do this work together. So thank you. I'm going to hand it back to y'all. Bethsaida.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Aryeh. That was great. So again, you know, we have mentioned several times that we are in a historic moment here, where our collective response to police violence and systemic racism is creating the greatest opportunity to make a radical shift from culture of fear and punishment to one of public health and mutual aid and safety and true safety. As we work to transition away from police and prisons to systems of care and community, how can we bridge our divides and dismantle the mentality of us versus them, right? This othering that we're so accustomed to. What are the actions we can take now to defund the police? And we are seeing already that that's happening, to defund our police and also prison systems, and to redirect resources to healthcare, housing, education, a livable wage, programs that support well-beings of our families and communities. And Zach's book, We Keep Us Safe, just came out actually before this pandemic hit. So in some ways, this is also, you know, I listened to the book and I feel like this is like the map towards what we've been talking about, and a map towards really looking about what we're looking to create. So I would like to just introduce Zach for a minute before we move on to the questions. Zach Norris is the executive director of the Ella Baker Center for Human Rights, author of We Keep Us Safe, Building Secure, Just, and Inclusive Communities, and co-founder of Restore Oakland, a community advocacy and training center that will empower Bay Area community members to transform local economic and justice systems and make a safe and secure future possible for themselves and for their families. Zach is also co-founder of Justice for Families, a national alliance of family-driven organizations working to end our nation's youth incarceration epidemic. Zach helped build California's first statewide network for families of incarcerated youth, which led the effort to close 5 youth prisons in the state, passed legislation to enable families to stay in contact with their loved ones, and defeated Prop 6, a destructive and ineffective criminal justice ballot measure. We Keep Us Safe, released in 2020, has been praised by Forbes, the San Francisco Chronicle, the Boston Globe, Kirkus Reviews. In addition to being a Harvard graduate and NYU educated attorney, Zach is also a graduate of the Labor Community Strategy Center's National School for Strategic Organizing in Los Angeles, California, and was a 2011 Soros Justice Fellow. Zach is also a loving husband and dedicated father to two bright daughters whom he is raising in his hometown right here in Oakland, California. So welcome, Zach.
Thank you, Zach.
I appreciate it. Oh, thanks. That's sweet.
I am so honored to be
Likewise.
here in your presence. And so to begin the conversation, we wanted to just start with your personal story of how you came into the work and the vision that you actually outlined in your book.
Right on. I feel like there's such spaciousness that you all have created in this conversation and with the grounding that I want to start my story a little bit back further and do a little bit of reading for the book, if that's okay. Just a few paragraphs. So this passage is part of a passage where I'm describing how different communities have been kind of scapegoated in our country's history. And it starts 1823, month unknown. A 7-year-old boy stood on the auction block in Richmond, Virginia. His mother was in the crowd begging her master not to sell her son. But the boy would fetch a good price. Slaveholders from the Deep South were more desperate for slaves since the abolition of the Atlantic slave trade in 1808, and since the cotton gin invented in 1794 had allowed the production of cotton to really take off. The prices of enslaved African people had risen. In this period, 1 in every 10 enslaved persons was relocated from the states of the Upper South to the Lower South. They were sold down the river into brutally hard labor in the Deep South with no means of staying connected to the families and communities they had known. Slightly over half of them experienced major family separations, meaning children were separated from their parents or spouses were separated from each other. The little boy was just at the cusp of his years of highest output too. The ages from 8 to 15 years according to popular wisdom among slaveholders. Children in these sought-after ages were often bought alone. On the auction blocks, enslaved people were lined up by height, making it even more likely that children would be separated from their parents. The buyers examined the little boy as though he were livestock, pulling his mouth open to see his teeth, pinching his arms and legs to find out how muscular they were, walking him up and down to detect any lameness, making him bend and stoop. In the end, he was sold to another slave master in Mississippi. His mother followed him to the wharf where he was put on a ship. When the ship launched into the water, his mother was left standing on the wharf crying. She never saw him again. The boy's name was Joseph Norris. He was my grandfather's grandfather. And I start with that story because it is, in my mind, so fundamental to safety. And I wrote this book about how we might keep each other safe. And Aryeh, as you were leading us in that exercise and asking us to connect to our felt notions of safety, I was thinking about the way in which so much of safety is tied to relationship, is tied to our knowing that someone has our back. And so I want to just ask if people wouldn't mind in the chat, just thinking about or including a time when you felt safe, where you were at, what were, some of the conditions. And we'll go ahead and give folks a second to think about that. But I would love to hear folks' thoughts on just a time when they felt safe. I see folks describing like a time when they were at home with their parents as a kid. Sometimes that family is biological, sometimes that is chosen family. But we know that this notion of relationship, sometimes it might be in a faith community, seeing in my grandmother's house with my family gathered, in my foster sister's home, having a hard conversation, but also building with her. That reminds me of, you know, one of my own stories is like having my grandmother hold my hands, and she would hold my hands in a way that was like a two-hand hold. You know, one hand holding my little hand in her hand, and the other hand just kind of tapping my little fingers, just like reminding me that she was there, that she had my back, you know, when I was doing well, but also if I made a mistake, that she was going to remind me of my higher purpose and what I was called to do, and bring me back to my better angel, so to speak. And that notion is, for me, something that I think we need to hold on to in this moment, because there are contending visions of how we get to safety. And one of the ways in which we have seen this country err is by not believing in the humanity of all of us, and consequently not respecting familial relationships among other relationships, as is reflected in that story. And so I brought that story because that's part of what animates me in this work, is really seeing and coming to understand that history, but also just seeing real disparities in terms of how young people are treated. And so you mentioned in the bio, I went to Harvard as an undergrad, but I grew up in East Oakland. And I saw just how differently young people at Harvard were treated when they had a mental health issue, or if they were using drugs, or if they got into a fight. They were always treated, as Brian Stevenson talks about, as if they were more than their worst mistake, right? And it was very clear that they had possibility and potential, and the institution, maybe cynically because they wanted to maintain their high graduation rates, or maybe because they were really invested in the students, I'm not sure, but they certainly made sure that there was a pathway for folks to continue their studies. Meanwhile, you know, my family and friends in East Oakland and across the Bay Area were getting locked up for doing some of the same things. And so those disparities, as an 18-year-old, finding my way in the world as a light-skinned African-American who's benefited from my own privileges as a light-skinned African-American male, as a cisgendered male, I was really grappling with these injustices. And that's part of what led me to work at the Ella Baker Center, and led me into this work where I got to meet Aryeh many moons ago with Art in Action. And so it's really great to be talking with you, Bethsaida, and with you, Aryeh. So just thank you for this opportunity.
Gracias. That's what's coming up for me in terms of like where did I remember a time when I felt safe, you know, was when I actually met some women professors in my first year of college in New York City. And they just brought me in, you know, to their kind of like world, and they held me. Mm-hmm. They were mostly African American and Latina women, mm-hmm. Who at the time there was this program there called the SEEK program that helped inner city youth coming out of the projects to go to college. Mm-hmm. And I lasted a year because although I had a lot of support in the university, when I went home, I didn't have that support, right? So I kind of like just anesthetized myself between the two worlds. I couldn't kind of, you know, feel safe at home. And so for me, you know, in terms of like what we're dealing with today in terms of like this anti-Blackness struggle that we're in, and the object violence of what, especially, you know, Black men and indigenous communities are actually dealing with. How is the book that you've written offer just kind of like a moving forward
Yeah.
as we kind of all are, because we all have different ways of thinking about how we're going to stop the violence, right?
Yeah. Yeah. No, I appreciate that question. What I'm hoping to do with the book is invite people into a conversation about how we get to safety, but also the history of this country. And I'll start with the history of this country because I think it helps to contextualize the demand of defunding the police that people are hearing. And, you know, we started by honoring that this is indigenous land that we stand on. And in California, as much as any state, um, the, the, the creation of statehood, the creation of this state really was founded in violence towards indigenous people and the murder and killing of indigenous people. And even before white settlers made it to California, they were steeped in rationalizations of violence towards indigenous people. And so even as they met people coming across, if you read some of the narratives, they had in their mind the savage, right? And the idea that they were going to be treated with brutality, even as it was contrary to their experience. But that had a huge impact. And this idea that, you know, part of the animating logic of the country was this idea that the only good Indian is a dead Indian. And I, you know, that's stark to say, but there's no other way to say it. That was the logic. And I think that we sometimes think that that history is so far in the past. But if you look at the past 5 presidents since Ronald Reagan, and Ronald Reagan describing the need for limited government and small government, if I could rebrand Ronald Reagan, I would say that his slogan should have been, the only good government is a death government, a government that is likely to produce death. And what do I mean by that? I mean, like, since the 80s, every time there's been a recession, California, across the country, you know, the only things that will never get cut are policing and prisons. And so recession after recession, healthcare and universal, well, we don't have universal childcare, but childcare period, and other forms of caring. So this is deeply embedded in terms of racism, but also patriarchy, right? Because the idea of caring for one another is seen as feminine and is derided as such. And so we have really built infrastructure for the things that accelerate the mortality and morbidity of Black and indigenous people and other people of color, policing and prisons. But also, as Reverend Barber says, there are these death measures on the down low, as he calls them. And by that, he means these other policies that also produce death, maybe not in as a visible way as a police killing, but, you know, for every 500,000 people who don't have health care, 2,800 people will die. 700 people die as a result of poverty, are some of the statistics that he quotes. And so I say that to say that what people are really calling for is a moral revitalization, to use some of Dr. Barber's words, a real reckoning with the history of our country and a shift in priorities that is at the scale of the problems that we're seeing. And so I will close by saying that this part, just by saying that, you know, there's an alternate vision of safety that's being put out that is not about a public health approach or recognizing our interdependence. It's really what I call the "he keeps us safe" lie. And that's the lie that this president is telling. And that's the lie that is embedded in structural racism, that some of us are more valuable than others, that men are more valuable than women. There's patriarchy, there's sexism, there's racism, there's ableism, there's so many ways in which we have created human hierarchies that undermine our capacity to really achieve safety. And this lie is also grounded in a form of abuse, because what abusers do is tell you, don't trust your neighbors, don't trust those who are closest to you, don't trust your neighbors in distant lands, don't trust your neighbors at the border, don't trust your neighbors around the corner, even though those folks want the same things for their families that we want for ours. And meanwhile, those who are in power, that abuser is really hiding the harms that are all around us, the institutional harms that I described, the interpersonal harms that disproportionately impact women and gender nonconforming folks. Those harms are ongoing and in fact are perpetrated by the powers that be, including this president. And so that vision of safety is one that we obviously need to reject. And some of what I describe in the book is how we move from that he keeps us safe lie, that framework of fear, to really understanding our interdependence, and that ultimately we keep us safe. So that's kind of what the book is about.
So one of the things that I think about when we talk about kind of like historically what we may think about what keeps us safe and what actually does keep us safe. And so I'm thinking about right at this moment in time, as we're kind of entering the struggle to defund the police and the criminal justice system, like there are people who are confused about the demand to defund the police. And they really don't know what that means. Even folks like in my community of folks that they're like, oh, so what's going to happen, right? If somebody comes to my door with a gun, for instance, you know, they always use the the most tragic thing. But what are the visionary aspects of the movement in terms of how we define safety, and what are the dimensions of that, right, as it relates to this confusion for folks?
Well, I think that's a great question. And I think that this is a big picture demand, right? It is an inclusive and encompassing vision of a different vision of safety. And I think the best way I can help folks understand it is like at a certain point when the climate science began to be overwhelming, that fossil fuels were creating pollution, that pollution is killing us, people started to see, okay, yes, we need to transition away from fossil fuels and to a different energy future and reduce the harm that is associated with that extractive model and move to a different one. And I think the same is true in the context of policing. And so we know that like less than 5% of actual police activity is responding to incidents of violence. And what has happened and over successive generations in the ways that I described is that police have come to be responsible for responding to a whole host of issues, from school discipline, as we've talked about, to mental health, drug use and abuse, unsheltered communities. And even folks who are themselves police chiefs will tell you, we have no business responding to these issues. We also believe, you know, many of them will say that we need a social safety net to actually address these issues. And so I think that the first thing is really to set the intention, to recognize that our model of safety, of severing ties, of ending relationships, of having an adversarial vision of how we get to safety has not served us. And let's begin to set the intention around how we get to a different notion, vision, practice of safety. And obviously that isn't going to happen overnight. It's not like an on-off switch, right? But what I think we can be doing, and there are articles that are coming out about this, one of which I was quoted in Vox responding to and looking at some of the different visions of community responders, and how in parts of this country, as well as internationally, social workers are being sent out to respond to folks in mental health crises. And counselors are developing their skills in restorative justice to be able to deal with school discipline issues or school fights and things like that. And so as we begin to make that shift away from a punitive response to public health issues, we also then begin to grow our capacity to care for one another, right? Because we're adopting approaches that will sustain our livelihoods, better take care of us. But the other benefit is that we're expanding our democratic muscle. Because what happens with restorative justice, with transformative justice, is the person who's caused harm, the person who's been harmed, are surrounded by those that care for them. And you all know this as folks who do restorative justice work, Bethsaida and Aryeh, so can tell about it better than I can. But my understanding is, like, through that process, it's not just about the accountability of those two individuals in the center of the circle. It's really about the broader accountability. And this is really, I think, an indigenous lens, worldview, is like really thinking about what was my responsibility, what do I owe generations ahead, and how do we solve this problem collectively? And through that process, I think we're really building our muscle to do democracy, right? And also to hold those powerful officials accountable, because quite frankly, those folks who have seen what's happening in the streets, who have seen people literally risking their lives to be out in Oakland protesting and demanding a defunding of the police, and who all they can do as elected officials is a 1% reduction of OPD's budget, is just terrible. It is not accountability. It is not democracy. And quite frankly, we can do better. And I think that as we begin to organize, as we begin to take care of each other, then we can also hold those folks who have some measure of privilege accountable, which is necessary in a complex society like the one we have.
Oh, thank you. And I just want to add that 1% of the Oakland City Council decision to fund 1% of the Oakland OPD budget is really, they're moving their cadet training for the next fiscal year. So really they're not.
It's a shell game.
Yeah. So I just feel like they have, the whole process was shameful and horrible, and we're continuing to do that work. But thank you. Aryeh, you're up next.
Yeah, and I just wanted to lift up this beautiful quote from Ruth Wilson Gilmore, where she says, "Abolition is about presence, not absence. Mm-hmm. It's about building life-affirming institutions."
That's right.
Right. And, I think that a lot of the fear and confusion comes from the sense that something's going to be taken away. And even if that something is causing harm, it's something we're familiar with. And there's a way that, that familiarity creates some kind of, safety or comfort or whatever that is. And it's, as we're in this huge transition away from both the extractive economy and these harmful institutions, it's just as important for organizers and for us to be painting that picture really clearly of what we're moving toward, right? And having that be compelling for us to feel that, like, yes, and not just the no in our bodies.
Absolutely. That's right. I think, and this isn't the best example, because the environmentalists among us may say that wind turbines and solar panels are not the end all be all, but I think certainly they provide some concrete, tangible picture that you can see in your mind in terms of, like, yes, we can move to a new energy future. And I think we need to be telling those stories and lifting up those visions moving forward. And so I want to do each of those things, if that's
okay. Please.
The first is a story, and the story is of Richmond, California in about 2003, 2004. And Richmond had one of the highest per capita murder rates in the country at that time. And the city council was, like, up in arms about what to do. They had declared a state of emergency. And the police believe they knew the 30, mostly young men, who they believe responsible for homicides in the city of Richmond. And Devone Bogan, who worked at the Mentoring Center in Oakland, said, I want to try a mentorship program for these young men. And there was a lot of skepticism and pushback, but ultimately, because they had tried a lot of other things, it seemed like less of a risk. Like, okay, we'll try it. We've tried everything else. And Devone, the way he described this story to me, the most important part for him is when he brought those young men into a room overlooking the city of Richmond, one of the nicest city buildings in Richmond, and said to them, you know, this city has been impacted by your actions, and this city has impacted you. And yet no one has asked you what you believe are the solutions to violence in the city of Richmond. And I want to engage you in that conversation. And here's what I have to offer in terms of this fellowship program. And he said, I'm going to provide you with, you know, daily positive mentorship, with a monthly stipend, and with travel opportunities. And what he did was started with travel opportunities around the city of Richmond and in the Bay Area. But as folks kind of got to know the program, he would say, well, if you want to come outside of California with me, you have to go with, you know, your compatriots who are from a rival neighborhood, right? And that trust that formerly incarcerated folks and his whole team had built created a space where that was possible. And as they took trips, not just outside of the state, but outside of the country, the walls between them came down, and a whole world really opened up to them about what was possible for them and for their future. And over, I think, like an 8-year period, homicides were reduced by some 70% in the city of Richmond. This was huge, not just for these young men, but for mothers and grandmothers who now believe they could take their kids to the local park, for shopkeepers and business owners who are like, yes, we're going to keep our businesses open for a couple hours longer. It was a huge victory, and one that should be kind of shouted from the rooftops. But unfortunately, many administrations, the Obama administration included, didn't really resource that vision. And I think some of what we have an opportunity to do now is seeing the violence and brutality and having that be center stage, is to be able to point to these kinds of solutions and to fund them at scale. And one other thing that I'll lift up just in terms of a brick and mortar vision is what we're doing at Restore Oakland, which is an 18,000 square foot building. It's a dedicated space for restorative justice, for transformative justice, a dedicated space for economic opportunity. And, you know, we're going to be doing some organizing. So speaking of holding elected officials accountable, we'll be organizing around issues of housing with Causa Justa Just Cause, the economy with the Restaurant Opportunity Centers United, and criminalization, the Ella Baker Center. And so all of these organizations are coming together in one space. And I think it's really trying to be the kind of, among other initiatives, that the solar panel and the wind turbine or the other permaculture or whatever the best environmental metaphor is, to really say, so many people have come to think of, and the public discussion has been dominated by prison bars and policing and guards. When you hear the term public safety, right, those are the kinds of images that come to mind, even though our felt understanding of safety is really about relationship and something else. And so Restore Oakland is trying to move us to actually having our felt notions of safety line up with our public policy.
Beautiful. It's so inspiring.
Oh, right on.
So that's in play right now.
It is in play. And so it's been, obviously, with COVID-19, we have kind of a few folks in the building and maintaining it. But one of the beautiful things, I think, is that because so many community members, including, I'm sure, folks on this call, have come out and supported Restore Oakland, unlike some businesses, I think it has I'm not even just going to say a possibility, it will survive this COVID-19 because of that community support. And so really excited about what will be possible when we come back from physical distancing.
It's beautiful. And just to lift up that Joshua dropped the link into the chat, so please check it out to find out more information about that.
And can I just add that actually Restore Oakland, the building that you're living in, is going to have a cafe in the ground floor, and it's actually going to be run by folks coming out of being incarcerated, which I can't wait to go.
That's right.
You know, I'm so looking forward to it. So
I appreciate that.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I'm wondering, Zach, because you brought this up earlier, and Bethsaida and I have been participants in a restorative justice circle called a citizen circle that has been, it started in the programs in Solano jail, and then came out as a reentry space for folks that were recently incarcerated, coming out, needing some support and connection, and local volunteers, community members. We've been going for a couple of years, and it meets weekly, and it's been a space of really deep relationship building and truth telling and love. There's just a love field that we all have cultivated over time. And I know that the community building circles is one aspect of restorative justice, that in some ways is preventative. And then there's harm circles, that are about repairing harm and supporting someone to be in accountability with the community.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering if you could just speak a little bit more to the role that restorative justice, plays in this vision in transitioning out of exile, out of a, punitive model of locking people up or canceling people out or throwing people, the disposability of people, which is so fundamentally violent for humanity, and just ways that you have witnessed or seen restorative justice, really be a way forward.
Right on. I appreciate that. And the first thing I'll name is our organization, the Al Baker Center, is not the expert in restorative justice and transformative justice. So we partner with Restorative Justice for Oakland Youth and Community Works, and also make this space available as an informal space. So both diversion for young people and keeping young people out of the system, restorative justice. We are holding plan to be holding some reentry support circles in the model that you described. And also just want the space to be available anytime someone's dealing with a harm or conflict, that we have a dedicated space. Because, courtrooms are also part of the mythology of safety in our country, right? The idea of law and order, and everybody receives their day in court, even though we know 95% of people plead out. And so that disposability happens even before you get to the prison system, right? Because most people, the prosecutor just says, look, you're looking at this much time, and if you try to take it to court, we're going to add on more time. And so most people are like, okay, I'm just going to plea out. And so we desperately need a different vision and a sacrosanct kind of sacred space to really demonstrate what healing looks like, to demonstrate what community building looks like. And so it's not just in that room, because we have a dedicated space for restorative justice within Restore Oakland, but it's really throughout the whole building that we're doing that community building work. And so our work at the Aryeh Baker Center in terms of reentry support and healing the harm that has happened to folks inside really starts inside of institutions. So we're organizing with folks inside of San Quentin and other facilities across the state. We're developing policy initiatives with them. We are engaging folks as those bills move through Sacramento. And then I'm really proud to say that some of the same folks who have worked to pass that legislation have now gotten out. Folks we've actually hired or who have become part of our membership. And then we do other kinds of just support for folks in terms of do you have a bike? Do you have the things you need? Do you have a laptop? And try to crowdsource some of that very physical and tangible support. and then partner with folks such as yourself. So would love to hear more about the circles that you all are holding, because I feel like we have a lot to learn in that regard.
Well, we'll drop I don't know if have a website for it. Came out of Community Works.
Right on.
But we can definitely, if folks are interested, follow up to share more information about plugging in to that particular circle. I'm thinking about, Zach, like, just also on the neighborhood level, because, there's the work that y'all are doing as organizations, and, and having these resource spaces where people can, address housing needs, address, economic development and job opportunities, and, all the things that are necessary in this fabric, right, that we are weaving together. And then there's also at the neighborhood level, I live in East Oakland in the Laurel neighborhood, and blessed to live in a place where we have a lot of like organized neighbors that are really connected to each other. We do a lot of social events, and we've been, engaged in mutual aid practices and ways of supporting each other during this time. And we're in the middle of planning like a series of conversations to talk about this. What does it look like for us as neighbors to really build true community safety?
Yeah.
Part of that is rooted obviously in relationship building and knowing each other and trusting each other. But I'm curious if you have any recommendations or advice about, what we might center in that conversation, or what particular kind of resources or skills would support us as a neighborhood, in building this kind of safety.
Yeah, I mean, I think it would be valuable for you also just to share, some of the ways in which you're providing mutual aid, because not everybody is doing that. And I think that is a critical piece. And so I kind of divided into the like aspects of what we do to keep us safe, like the mutual aid and the support for one another, but then also how are we working to change the systems, which really relates back to the Thrive mission and the various aspects of that mission. What we've seen is that most neighborhood organization, the dominant strain of it is based on a kind of suspicion-based framework, right? And every year, the first Tuesday of August, for example, folks come out for National Night Out. And that's been happening since the early 80s in cities across the country. And I think the basic spirit of it is not a bad one. It's saying when neighbors come out, when we know each other, we reclaim community safety. But quite frankly, the message that has been put out by law enforcement and by the police has been really limited. And basically they say, you're the eyes and ears of the police, and if you see something, say something. And we know that framework of encouraging suspicion, of watching our neighbors rather than seeing them, has had deadly results. And in fact, we started a kind of alternate initiative called Night Out for Safety and Liberation after the murder of Trayvon Martin by George Zimmerman, who's a neighborhood watch, a self-proclaimed kind of neighborhood watch captain. And so I think that folks should be engaged in knowing their neighbors and providing mutual aid and connecting, what do you need? How can I be supportive? But also in shifting some of that infrastructure, because that's part of our quote unquote safety and infrastructure. And for the most part, it has been leveraged by elected officials to be able to say, see, these folks are saying we need more and more police. And not recognizing that people have more than eyes and ears, right? That we have hearts, we have minds, we have hands. There are a lot of ways that people can contribute to community safety. When we mentor a young person, we're contributing to community safety. When we hold a restorative circle for someone who's coming out of the system, we're contributing to community safety. And when we volunteer in our schools, we're contributing to community safety. And so what we have tried to do every first Tuesday in August since the murder of Trayvon Martin is really bring that more holistic vision around what safety is, and get people to not just kind of feel it and share it with their neighbors, but to share it with elected officials to say, I agree with the demands to move in a different direction, to actually fund first responders as opposed to the police, and to address public health issues with public health solutions. And so I think all of those are ways that people can kind of engage in really building out safety on a neighborhood level.
What was the name of that again? The National Night Out for...
Yeah, it's called Night Out for Safety and Liberation, and I can put it in the chat.
So someone just dropped it. NOSL.US, OWE.
Oh, .us, you're right. I'm sorry. I'm putting the wrong information in the chat. So the second thing there. And, you know, one of the things that's interesting this year is that they had to move it to October night out, National Night Out, because of physical distancing. They're not planning to do it in August, but planning to do it potentially in October. And the thing that struck me is, like, if we had had public health infrastructure, if we had had adequate testing, if we had not adopted a sort of suspicion-based framework around how we get to safety, we might actually be able to be doing Night Out in August. We might have had done the testing and been in a different position, as other countries are, who have adequate healthcare, who have a decent social safety net. And because we've so relied on this framework of fear, like, we've crowded out the real solutions that are all around us, you know? And so I think that this October 6th is when we're going to be doing Night Out for Safety and Liberation. And I think it'll be a great opportunity to really be talking about what's at stake with the elections in November, but also how do we build our long-term vision of safety? Because I believe, at least, that I'm not convinced that either of these candidates are going to take us there, but we have to really build that safety ourselves in our communities and take advantage of the opportunity to get the fear-mongerer in chief out of the White House. So those are my thoughts on that.
You know, I think also one of the aspects that we're losing around this time of the pandemic, and now of the demonstrations, and hopefully there's some work being done behind the scenes, but it's the whole census, right? The census that we're supposed to be kind of, like, I think, completing by the end of this year. And I am somebody who actually was hired to go to people's houses to do the census, and they called me and said we were going to start June 22nd, and then they called me again and said we're moving it to August. And now that the numbers are in terms of COVID are starting to, I think they said we've had 69% uptick in California, that it will push the census again. And I think it's important that, I know that Stacey Abrams has been doing a lot of campaigning around the census, but I feel like it's not getting to the folks that need to know how important the census is. The folks that are going to be afraid to get on their computer and put the information in because, you know, the whole immigration issue. And so I just, yeah, there's just so many things that are going on.
Yeah, we have been doing some of that work to try to move folks to complete the census as well. NIFA is one of our organizers who's been helping to lead that work. And I think you're absolutely right, it's critical. And with so much just like manipulation of our democracy, we are going to, you know, have to take risks and to do so in a way that is calculated and that is smart. But I think when so much of our infrastructure, as I've talked about, is geared towards a vision of safety that is about separation, that actually doesn't make us safe, that worsen cycles of poverty and incarceration. In order to move from that status quo and to get to safety, we're going to actually have to take risks. And one of the things that I am kind of emboldened by is just seeing people out in the streets and being out there with folks who are taking those risks and doing ways that are appropriate to, you know, our different risk levels and all of that. But that piece is something that I think we're going to have to think through. Like, what are the ways that we can get this census collected? How do we really mobilize folks this November, even around, you know, just some of the issues we've talked about tonight? There's a number of city council races and things happening in November that I think we need to be paying attention to.
Can you just name the person who's doing the census work at your organization? Because I'd be interested in
Nifa, and I can definitely, I can connect you over email.
Great. Thanks.
Yeah.
So, you know, I always think like 90 minutes is a lot of time, but it really isn't. And I wanted to get to this part of our conversation, which for me, it's like, you know, since the uprisings of 2014, 2015, you know, 24 states have actually passed at least 40 new measures addressing, you know, things as officers, you know, wearing cameras and training around racial bias and independent investigations when police use force, new limits on the flow of surplus military equipment. And, you know, and for me, I guess it feels like those were intentionally something that people felt like it was going to actually cure the violence that we are experiencing from this militarized force. And as we're seeing, it's not working, right? The cameras get turned off. The systems that they have put in place to do independent investigations have really not been fruitful. Trainings on racial bias, you know, folks are reporting that, you know, officers just sit there and they're like, why do I have to be here? I don't want to do this shit, you know? So I guess for me, in terms of, you know, I see, you know, like as Aryeh went through the list of all the wins and half wins that we've been currently experiencing, how do we just kind of engage on a much larger scale, a national scale, to train folks to engage in the work? And how do we support that, right? And how do we support just kind of like the campaigns of Black Lives Matter through either, you know, the Ella Baker Center, through, you know, Thrive, through, you know, the book. I think this book is actually, it really is a document that should be used as a platform for all the issues that we're working with. Yeah, like holding book events, I'd be interested in a study group.
Right on.
Right?
Yeah. So we have not as yet organized study groups or book discussions, but I'd be open to helping support that and thinking about what that might look like. That's just to answer that very specific question. But working with Beacon Press, if folks are interested in getting like a number of books, I can see if there's, you know, discount possibilities or those kinds of things. I will just say that I agree with you. Like, I think that when the uprisings happened connected to Ferguson and New York and different places in 2014, 2015, I think that there were a broader set of demands. And those of us who had been doing the work for longer, and, you know, folks like Critical Resistance and others who really had kind of seen that story play out over time, were like, hey, we're trying to tell you, no, this is not going to work. you actually need more transformative change, it didn't necessarily get the play that it's getting now. And I think now people are really seeing that more transformative change is necessary. And that's why I'm hopeful, because you can't change something unless you really understand the problem itself and the depth of the problem. And so people are saying like, oh, defund the police, that sounds so radical. But, you know, radical means getting to the root of the problem, right? And so for me, it is radical, and it is at the same time common sense if you actually understand and listen to the wisdom behind what the demand is about. And there are concrete steps. So it isn't, as I said before, just like a flip of the switch, but, you know, taking the step to eliminate policing in schools, or that there's a separate police department in schools, is a huge first step. Obviously, 911 may still be called, and the Oakland Police Department may still end up showing up at schools. And so it's not the kind of end all be all or flip of a switch, but I think that what we can start doing is reversing the ways in which we have begun to treat so many different issues as issues that deserve criminalization. And that requires a couple of things. It requires, one, continuing to challenge and bring down the structures of racism, lifting up the history of our country, because you can't, the fundamental premise of my book is that when we take care of the public, we take care of public safety, right? But if you don't see the public as everyone, then it's very easy to scapegoat and to, you know, dispose of folks and do the kind of death producing systems that we have with our criminal court system. But if we begin to really challenge that notion, build our beloved community, understand that all of us are part of that community, then slowly but surely the ideas that looked radical are no longer so radical. I talk about in my book the way in which, like, cities like, I think it was Burlington, Vermont, and a couple other places, as folks were experiencing the height of the opioid crisis in some of these rural communities in the Northeast, it was the police chief who was reaching out to hospital officials. Can you imagine the police chief reaching out to hospital officials and saying, hey, no, what we're doing is wrong here. Like, this person has a substance abuse problem in their words, and we need to actually get them some relief immediately, and then get them into a program if they so choose that would help them. That was possible because that police chief knew and had cousins who were impacted, or could see the people's humanity who were being harmed by this opioid crisis. And I think that that's possible across the country, that kind of harm prevention approach is possible across the country. But the work of people being out in the streets, the work of taking down those monuments is also critical, because if we don't see each other as human, we can't get there.
I'm thinking, you know, there's an aspect of this pandemic time, you know, that laid some ground, you know, of re-envisioning who we are and what matters. And I don't know who said this, but this quote, I remember that it's easier to imagine the end of the world than it is to imagine the end of capitalism, you know, was like true, you know, in this way of like trying to really shift this deeply entrenched model that we invented, you know what I mean? We can reinvent, but there was a way that, one, you know, we had to pause and slow down the gears of the capitalist machine, you know, that made many things that seemed impossible all of a sudden more possible, you know. And we began to see the healing that started happening, you know, in regeneration of ecosystems and in the wild, and, you know, and seeing our interdependence, both through the contagion, but also in the ways that people really begin to practice mutual aid and really put our collective well-being at the center rather than profit,
That's right.
And so I'm curious, like, what you're seeing, is what's different now, because obviously we, the cycles, and, we've been here, and there's been sustained protest every single day since George Floyd was killed. I'm curious just your thoughts on, what this time, the fertile conditions of this moment is allowing for in moving us, into the world that we want to live in.
I mean, I think there is a deep questioning among young people in particular of the logic of capitalism. And that is reflected in this multicolored and multigendered and just amazingly diverse movement of people who are coming out into the streets and supporting the demand that our policies and practices reflect the idea that Black Lives Matter. And so one thing that is unique to me in this moment is this understanding of the specificity of oppression, but not letting that necessarily prevent us from being in solidarity with one another, right? And so oftentimes in the past, I think that there's been this rush to say we're all the same. But now what I see is like people saying, no, we're not necessarily all the same, but we have commonality, and being able to bridge that and understanding that, as someone on a panel said earlier today, if Black people are free, there's a much higher likelihood that we're all free, right? That when the most marginalized are put at the center, then we develop systems that benefit all of us, right? And that kind of understanding, I think, is being played out in movements in ways that I think are deeply inspiring and just give me hope that there's a possibility in this. And I think also that people aren't, and this goes back to the point that Bethsaida rose around the nature of our demands, that people aren't settling for like, okay, and we need the body cameras, right?
Mm-hmm.
As Reverend Barber said, like when the Heroes Act or whatever the name of it was came, they gave like $3 trillion, right, or something crazy to corporations, and so, but they want our demands to say, what's the one thing you want, right? So, and then he said, don't ask us to tell us the one thing we want when you're giving away 3 trillion things, right? So I think that there's this real sense of the interconnectedness of our struggle, while not trying to just kind of whitewash it and say we're all the same, and this real understanding that we need the different aspects of a just transition to move away from this economic system, to move away from kind of white settler capitalism that we've talked about.
And throughout your book, you actually uplift people's stories in a way that actually is testimony to the trauma that especially oppressed people have experienced. And I'm just kind of thinking of like the activists in my life today and around me and my experience as an activist in the past. And that's been the whole issue of like, as we're kind of talking about these things, and I in listening to your book, because I didn't read it, I did have some kind of like stuff that came up for me around my own kind of like places where I've been traumatized. And so I guess I would love if you could just speak to the young activists today, and speak to like how do you do self-care and how do you deal with that trauma that will come up, right? It does come up as we're out there and we're being shot by rubber bullets and the like.
Yeah. I think that one thing is just to, as best we can, really recognize what our vulnerabilities, what the systems of oppression are, and how they impact us as individuals. And so as a cisgender, light-skinned African-American male, like I've tried to understand where should I be stepping up, where should I be stepping back, and listen to others. And that's been a process for me, and I haven't always gotten that right. And having some humility. Self-care is something that has been a group process, right? I'm not a leader in that regard, is one thing I've had to acknowledge. What I've seen is people within my own organization really push me on that, and in ways that were loving and calling me in. And then I've seen us as an organization start to adopt different practices that I didn't know would have such a huge impact on my well-being. And so it was like, oh my gosh, we have oatmeal at the office, and now I'm eating breakfast, and all of my morning meetings are coming out so much better. It's like, what happened? You know, it's like, and so like, part of it is around trying to surround yourself in good community, right? And there are different moments of entry or pathways of entering this movement. And so I would say some of it is also trusting your gut to say, like, yes, these folks have the right analysis, but something doesn't feel right. And maybe this isn't the path for me. And maybe I need to find a different community that resonates with me, both in terms of the politics, but also into the personal and how we're relating to one another. And so that's been, you know, something where I've learned as much as I've led. And actually, I should say I've learned a lot more than I've led.
I'd love to just speak to the story that you shared in the beginning about your grandmother, you know, holding your hands with the two hands. And there's a beautiful book called My Grandmother's Hands by Resmaa Menakem that is circulating.
It's on my list.
Yes, right. And he's really talking about the intergenerational trauma that lives in white bodies, that lives in Black bodies, that lives in police bodies, and that we need to do all the policy work, and we need to do the systems work. And, you know, we need to do the work to heal how it lives in our bodies and in our nervous systems, you know, because when we go into fight, flight, freeze, you know, all the reactions, all the ways that we cause harm can, you know, just be at the trigger. And so, you know, how do we deepen in our somatic practices? How do we deepen in our ancestral connections? And the legacies of, you know, and traditions of resilience that we carry, that, in, you know, many of us, because of colonization, you know, have been cut off from, you know, in different ways. And
the work of Forward Together,
yes,
and like so many amazing organizations, Walking the Talk and Generative Somatics, and Black Organizing for Leadership and Dignity, which I've had the opportunity to participate in. And it really is those moments when you have that safety, right? Of being around a like-minded community and remembering that folks have your back. And so when I've done kind of some of the most, in my mind, courageous, like civil disobediences or different actions that I've taken a part of, it's been a combination of like remembering that, but also being surrounded by people who I know have my back, that has helped me to be able to continue to be a part of work that can be hard and where there's, you know, danger present.
Wow, so we've come actually to the part where we're actually closing up the conversation. This has been amazing. Zach, this is the first time I met you, and I feel like we've known each other for a long time. I think I was at your birth when you were born. So I'm just kind of wondering if you have any last thoughts that you would like to share that you didn't have an opportunity to be asked.
No, I just want to appreciate Thrive and appreciate the work that y'all are doing and the intention that you're bringing and the vision that you have of what's possible. And that is inspiring. And I feel really grateful to have had an opportunity to talk with you all. And I feel like I'm still learning. I see in the chat, Indigenous Peoples' History of the United States. I've been reading that, and shout out to Roxanne. Peace. Yes.
There's a question here if there's a center or group in San Francisco that are working with, along the lines like Restore Oakland and some of the things that you named happening here in the East Bay.
Yeah, I mean, there's some amazing work happening in San Francisco. One group I would lift up is the Young Women's Freedom Center, which is doing dope work in San Francisco and across the Bay Area. They have been successful in challenging the construction of the juvenile hall in San Francisco. Obviously, All of Us or None has roots in San Francisco and is doing amazing work. So those are just a couple of organizations that kind of come to mind. And then in the peninsula, I know folks are doing really great work in East Palo Alto, among other areas. I am happy to connect with folks. So if you want to connect with me, you can always email me at zach@ellabakercenter.org, and we can continue the conversation there as well.
Beautiful.
But yeah, I think mostly what I wanted to communicate is just that I have a lot of gratitude, and I have a lot of gratitude because there are folks such as yourselves who really understand the depth of change that is necessary in this country, and who our grounded moments are unfazed by what we have to do. And so I appreciate you both for helping to create that space and remind us of what is possible. And what we're capable of. So thank you.
Thank you so much for bringing your wisdom and your vision and your stories and all the inspiring stories that we need. We're so inundated with the atrocities all the time, and we have to feed ourselves with these stories of what's possible.
Right on.
So I wanted to share a couple of announcements. There will be a video of this conversation made available in the next couple of days, and there's a whole archive of conversations with amazing folks. Sonia Renee Taylor that Bethsaida hosted with Taj James and Brenda Salgado, with Akaya Winwood. Next Wednesday, we will be hosting a spiral of resilience using the work that reconnects to actually go deeper on this conversation about building safety and alternatives to policing. So from 5 to 6:30, you can check the medicine for these times at thriveeastbay.org. And then this coming Sunday, July 5th, or actually not this Sunday, on July 5th at 4 p.m., we're hosting a special Thrive called Interdependence in the Inner Work of Racial Justice, with the author Rhonda McGee, who's phenomenal, along with Kyle Lemley, who's the director of the Thrive Choir, and Mazin Jamal, who's also a member of the choir and is phenomenal. So please stay tuned and join us for these upcoming events. Every Friday, we highlight artists, and Wednesdays there's resilience practices. So check out what we're up to, and I'm going to hand it to Bethsaida to close us with a poem.
Great. I just don't want to leave out the attendees that are here with us. I just want to thank you for taking the time to be with us and to share this space with all of us. And so I'm going to read a poem that was actually written in 2009 for Barack Obama's presidential inauguration. And the name of the song is Praise Song for the Day by Elizabeth Alexander. And I read this and I was just kind of profoundly affected by it. So here it is. Each day we go out about our business, walking past each other, catching each other's eyes or not, about to speak or speaking. All about us is noise. All about us is noise and bramble, thorn and din, each one of our ancestors on our tongues. Someone is stitching up a hem, darning a hole in a uniform, patching a tire, repairing the things in need of repair. Someone is trying to make music somewhere with a pair of wooden spoons and oil drum, with cello, boombox, harmonica, voice. A woman and her son wait for the bus. A farmer considers the changing sky. A teacher says, take out your pencils, begin. We encounter each other in words, words spiny or smooth, whispered or declaimed, words to consider, reconsider. We cross dirt roads and highways that mark the will of someone and then others who said, I need to see what's on the other side. I know that there's something better down the road. We need to find a place where we are safe. We walk into that which we cannot yet see. Say it plain that many have died for this day. Sing the names of the dead who brought us here, who laid the train tracks, raised the bridges, picked the cotton and the lettuce, built brick by brick the glittering edifices. They would then keep clean and work inside of. Praise song for struggle, praise song for the day, praise song for every hand lettered sign, the figuring it all out at kitchen tables. Some live by love, thy neighbor as thyself. Others by first do no harm or take no more than you need. What if the mightiest word is love? Love beyond marital, filial, national. Love that casts a whitening pool of light. Love with no need to preempt grievance. In today's sharp sparkle, this winter air, only thing can be made, any sentence begun. On the brink, on the brim, on the cusp, praise song for walking forward in that light. Thank you. Ooh.
Thank you, Zach.
Thank you.
Bethsaida.
Thank you, Aryeh. Really appreciate you. Thank you, Thrive.
Gratitude.
And I just want to thank Joshua, who's been behind the scenes doing all the tech stuff. Thank you. We so love your support. And you could take us down with some music, Joshua, before everybody leaves.
Missing the world, I hope I see you again someday. In isolation, trying to find the right words to say. To the rest of the world, from Oakland to the rest of the world, I love you.
So,
All right. I love y'all.
yeah.
Everyone.